What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan here on Max Afterburner. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've also flown the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220 as an airline pilot for many years, so I bring a little bit of every side of aviation and a whole lot of fighter jet background to breaking down what's happening right now with the bunker buster bombs the U.S. military just unleashed across Iran. This is a fast-moving story, so before I get into any of my own analysis, I want to be upfront with you. Everything I'm about to walk you through is pulled from verified reporting, official Pentagon and CENTCOM statements, and confirmed on the record quotes. Anywhere I'm giving you my own opinion as a pilot, or anywhere something is still unconfirmed, I'm going to tell you clearly that it's unconfirmed. I'm not going to feed you speculation dressed up as fact. So let's get into it. First, a quick reset on where we are, because this conflict has had a lot of twists and turns, and I want you to have the full picture before we get to the bombs themselves. This current war between the United States, Israel, and Iran broke out on February 28, 2026, after U.S. and Israeli strikes killed several senior Iranian officials, including the supreme leader. That set off a chain reaction: Iranian missile and drone attacks against Israel, against American bases across the region, and a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which, if you don't know, is the narrow waterway that something like 1/5 of the entire world's oil and gas supply has to pass through. Hezbollah jumped in from Lebanon within days. Gulf states like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait eventually got pulled in too after Iranian strikes hit their territory. There was a ceasefire that started April 8th, but it has been tested and broken more than once. A memorandum of understanding was signed in mid-June that partially reopened the strait, and for a few weeks it looked like things might actually settle down. That did not last. On July 7th, Iran allegedly struck multiple commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States responded with strikes on Iranian territory. Since then, we've been in a new and heavier round of hostilities, and that's really the backdrop for what I want to walk you through today. Now let's talk about the actual weapons, because this is where my background can hopefully add something useful. When people hear bunker buster, they usually picture one specific bomb. But there are actually a few different bunker busters in the U.S. arsenal, and they've all shown up in this war at different points. So let's go through them so you understand what you're looking at when you see this footage online. At the top of the list is the GBU-57, also called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP. This thing is enormous, about 30,000 pounds, with a steel casing that's built to punch through roughly 200 feet of rock or reinforced concrete before it goes off. It is the largest conventional bunker buster in the world, and the only aircraft cleared to carry and drop it is the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber because of both its size and the specialized release systems involved. This is the weapon that got used in Operation Midnight Hammer back in June of 2025, when B-2s flew all the way from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and dropped multiple MOPs on Iran's Fordo nuclear enrichment site, which is buried an estimated 80 meters underground. That strike was the first time the MOP had ever been used operationally, and it's a big reason the Air Force went back to Boeing earlier this year, worth more than $100 million, specifically to replenish the MOPs that were expended during that operation, because there just aren't that many of them in the inventory. Estimates put the total U.S. stockpile somewhere around 20 or so. Then you've got a middle-tier weapon, the GBU-72, known as the Advanced 5K Penetrator. This one is in the 5,000-pound class, so it's a fraction of the size of the MOP, but it's a newer design meant to replace the older GBU-28 that's been around since the early 90s. It uses a GPS-assisted inertial navigation guidance kit, similar to the kits used on the smaller 2,000-pound JDAM bombs, mated to a much heavier penetrating warhead called the BLU-138. What's interesting is that warhead actually uses the same two explosive compounds, PBXN-109 and AFX-757, that are packed into the giant MOPS warhead, just in a much smaller package. This one can be carried by more than just the B-2. It's been tested on the F-15E Strike Eagle and the B-1 bomber as well, which makes it a lot more flexible for repeated strikes than the MOP. In March of this year, CENTCOM confirmed U.S. forces used multiple 5,000-pound penetrator weapons like this against underground Iranian storage facilities holding coastal defense cruise missiles near the Strait of Hormuz, and that appears to have been the combat debut of the GBU-72. And then you've got the more conventional bunker busters, the 2,000-pound class weapons built around the BLU-109 warhead, typically delivered as GBU-31 JDAMs. These aren't in the same league as the MOP or even the GBU-72 in terms of penetration depth, but they're far more numerous. They can be carried by a wide range of aircraft, including the B-52 and B-1. And they've been used repeatedly throughout this war against ammunition depots and hardened military infrastructure, including a strike Trump publicized on a large ammunition depot in Isfahan. So when people say the U.S. military just unleashed bunker buster bombs across Iran, understand that's not one single weapon. It's really a layered toolkit, from the 2,000-pound class all the way up to the 30,000-pound MOP. And which one gets used depends entirely on how deep and how hardened the target is. I also want to touch on something that doesn't get talked about enough, which is how these weapons actually get built and delivered to the fleet, because it matters for understanding how sustainable a campaign like this actually is. Boeing is the sole source manufacturer for the GBU-57, meaning there is no second vendor the Air Force can turn to if they need more of them quickly. That's part of why the contract awarded earlier this year had to be a sole source award rather than a competitive bid. The justification documents specifically said going through a competitive process would create unacceptable delays and put Global Strike Command's readiness at risk. Delivery on that latest batch isn't expected to start until January of 2028, which tells you something important. Whatever inventory of MOPs the U.S. has right now is essentially what they're working with for the next couple of years. There isn't a fast way to surge more of them into existence if this conflict drags on. That's a real constraint on military planning, and it's part of why you don't see the MOP used casually. Every one of those weapons that gets dropped is coming out of a very limited and slow to replenish stockpile. Now here's where it gets serious, and where I want to walk you through exactly what's confirmed as of right now. After that ceasefire broke down on July 7th, U.S. Central Command announced a 5-hour strike mission that hit Iranian coastal defense systems, missile and drone sites, and maritime targets across multiple cities. CENTCOM specifically confirmed strikes in Bushehr, Chabahar, Jask, Kanarak, Abu Musa, and Bandar Abbas. President Trump told radio host Hugh Hewitt the U.S. would hit Iran hard that night and the next day, and said current military action could run another 2 to 3 weeks. CENTCOM said American forces have now struck more than 8,000 targets inside Iran since this war began, including something like 130 vessels, and that number has been climbing fast in just the last few days. On July 9th, Al Jazeera and multiple other outlets confirmed blasts across southern Iran following further exchanges, with Iran striking back against Gulf state targets. So to be clear, as of this week, we are in an active, escalating, confirmed bombing campaign. This is not speculation. This is coming straight from CENTCOM statements and Pentagon officials on the record. I want to give you a little more context on why the Strait of Hormuz keeps coming up over and over in this story, because I don't think people outside of aviation and logistics fully appreciate how central it is. Roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil and gas supply moves through that one narrow waterway. It's only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, with shipping lanes on either side that are just a couple miles across. When Iran blocks or threatens that strait, it's not just a regional problem, it ripples through the global economy almost immediately. And we actually saw that play out. Gas prices in the U.S. hit $4 a gallon for the first time since 2022 during one of the earlier phases of this conflict. And the International Monetary Fund put out a warning that the broader war was driving higher prices and slower growth worldwide. That's part of why you've seen Trump talk about reinstating a naval blockade, and even floating the idea of the U.S. charging a fee to guarantee safe passage through the strait. Whoever controls access to that waterway has enormous leverage over global energy markets. And that leverage is a big part of what's driving the military calculus on both sides right now, not just the nuclear question. Now let's talk about the name that's all over the headlines right now, Pickaxe Mountain. This is where I want to slow down and separate what's confirmed from what's still just a threat. Pickaxe Mountain, known in Farsi as Kueh Kolangazlah, is a suspected Iranian nuclear site built into a mountain about 1.5 miles south of the Natanz enrichment complex in Isfahan province, right in the Zagros mountain range. Construction there began back in 2020, not long after a sabotage operation widely attributed to Israel destroyed an advanced centrifuge production building at Natanz. Iran has described Pickaxe Mountain publicly as a centrifuge assembly plant, but international inspectors from the IAEA have never been allowed inside, so that description hasn't been independently verified. The mountain itself rises to more than 5,000 feet. The facility is believed to include 2 separate tunnel complexes, and depending on which assessment you read, the depth of burial is somewhere between 80 meters and as much as 2,000 feet of granite. That's a wide range, because, again, nobody outside Iran has confirmed the internal layout. Here's the important part. Pickaxe Mountain has never actually been struck. It wasn't hit during the 12-day war back in June of 2025, and it hasn't been hit in this current war either, even though the facility sits right next door to Natanz, which has been repeatedly bombed. What changed this week is that President Trump specifically named it as a possible target in that same interview with Hugh Hewitt, saying, and I'm going to give you his actual words here because precision matters on something like this. He said Pickaxe is a possible target for a nice big fat shot right in the front door, and he said the U.S. would probably give Pickaxe a shot relatively soon. So that's a direct, on the record threat from the president. But as of this recording, it is still a threat and not a confirmed strike. I want to be really careful with that distinction because there is a lot of noise online right now blurring the line between what Trump said he might do and what has actually happened, and I don't want to be part of spreading that confusion. Now, as a pilot, let me give you my honest read on the Pickaxe Mountain question, because this is genuinely one of the more fascinating problems in modern air power. Multiple independent weapons experts have publicly questioned whether even the MOP, the biggest bunker buster in the American arsenal, is powerful enough to meaningfully destroy a facility buried under that much rock. The Institute for Science and International Security has been tracking the site through satellite imagery for years and reported as recently as early July that they're still seeing vehicle activity and hardening work at the tunnel entrances, meaning construction hasn't stopped despite everything going on around it. Some analysts have said that even a successful strike with multiple deep penetration weapons probably wouldn't vaporize the mountain. What it would more likely do is fracture the surrounding rock layers, destabilize the slopes, and potentially trigger landslides that could seal the tunnel entrances without ever actually destroying whatever is inside. That's a very different outcome than what happened at Fordo, and it's worth understanding why. Fordo, even though it's deep, is a known quantity. The West has had detailed knowledge of its internal structure since 2018 documents obtained from Iran's nuclear archive. Pickaxe Mountain is comparatively a black box. Nobody has ever been inside. Nobody outside of Iran has confirmed exactly how deep the working areas actually are. And that uncertainty is exactly why military planners take a target like this so seriously before committing to a strike package. Let me put the two sites side by side for you because I think it really drives the point home. Fordo sits roughly 80 meters underground. That's a little over 260 feet. And even at that depth, it took multiple MOPs stacked in sequence during Midnight Hammer to do the kind of damage the Pentagon was after. And even now, there's genuine debate among outside experts about exactly how much of that facility survived. Pickaxe Mountain, by some of the assessments I mentioned, could be buried under as much as 2,000 feet of solid granite. That's not a small step up from Fordo. That's almost an order of magnitude deeper into much harder material than the layered rock and soil at Fordo. Granite is a dramatically tougher medium for a penetrator to work through than the softer geology at some other sites. And that's before you even consider that the tunnel complex at Pickaxe Mountain has had 6 years of continuous construction and hardening work done to it since 2020. So when weapons experts say this could be beyond the reach of even the MOP, that's not people being dramatic for a headline. That's a straightforward engineering assessment based on published penetration figures for the weapon, compared against the estimated depth of the target. I also want to give you the numbers on what this war has already cost, because I think it's important for understanding the scale of what we're talking about. As of June of this year, independent estimates put the cost to U.S. taxpayers at over $113 billion. CENTCOM has confirmed strikes on a huge range of nuclear-linked sites beyond Fordo, including the enrichment halls at Natanz, the Kondab heavy water complex near Iraq, uranium conversion and metallurgy facilities at Isfahan, and a yellowcake production plant in Yazd province. There have also been strikes that hit areas near universities and residential neighborhoods, and independent reporting has documented civilian casualties on both sides of this conflict. That's something I think is important to acknowledge honestly rather than just focus on the hardware, because real people are caught in the middle of this regardless of which side of the politics you land on. Let's get back to the bombs themselves for a minute because I want to explain in plain terms how these things actually work, since I think it helps to understand why depth is such a big deal. A bunker buster isn't designed to explode on impact like a normal bomb. Instead, it's built with a hardened steel casing, sometimes forged rather than cast, so it can survive the shock of hitting concrete or rock without shattering. And it uses its own weight and velocity to physically bury itself into the ground or through a structure before detonating. Some of these weapons use what's called a delayed fuse, meaning the fuse doesn't trigger on first contact. It can actually sense the transition from solid material into open space, like when it punches through a layer of rock into a hollowed-out tunnel, and that's when it goes off, which concentrates the blast energy inside the structure instead of wasting most of it on the surface. That's the whole game with these weapons. It's not really about the size of the boom, it's about where the boom happens. A bomb that explodes on the surface of a mountain does very little to something buried 200 feet down. A bomb that gets 200 feet down before it detonates can collapse tunnels, destroy equipment, and in some cases cause enough overpressure to be lethal to anyone inside, all without a giant visible crater on the surface, which is actually why some of this recent footage online can be misleading. Sometimes, the most devastating bunker buster strikes don't look nearly as dramatic from the outside as a normal bomb hit would. I want to walk you through the aircraft side of this too, because that's often overlooked. The B-2 Spirit is still the only platform cleared to carry the MOP, And that's by design. The B-2's whole reason for existing is to penetrate contested airspace undetected and deliver exactly this kind of weapon against exactly this kind of target. Getting a B-2 all the way from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri to a target in Iran and back is an enormous undertaking. We're talking about extremely long duration missions with multiple aerial refuelings. And the fact that Midnight Hammer pulled that off successfully last year tells you a lot about the training and the logistics behind Air Force Global Strike Command. For the lighter GBU-72 strikes, the aircraft options open up quite a bit. F-15E Strike Eagles, which I flew in a different variant for years in the Air Force, are combat proven for exactly this kind of precision strike mission, and B-1 bombers have also been photographed carrying the weapon externally. That flexibility matters a lot strategically because it means the U.S. isn't dependent on a small handful of stealth bombers for every single bunker buster mission. They can spread that capability across multiple aircraft types and fly a much higher operational tempo. Something else worth mentioning, because I think it shows how seriously the Pentagon is taking the demand for these weapons going forward. The Air Force is already working on what's being called the Next Generation Penetrator, or NGP. And the most recent GBU-57 contract with Boeing is actually expected to be the last lot of the current MOP design before that transition happens. So even separate from what's happening in Iran right now, there's a broader effort underway to build the next generation of deep strike weapons, which tells you the Pentagon expects hardened, deeply buried targets to keep being a problem they need to solve for years to come, not just in this specific conflict. Now let me give you my honest opinion as a pilot on where I think this goes from here, and I want to be clear, this next part is analysis, not confirmed fact. Based on what's public right now, I think the most likely near-term outcome is continued strikes on the targets that are already confirmed and accessible: coastal missile sites, drone and radar infrastructure, ammunition depots, the kind of targets that don't require the MOP and can be hit repeatedly with the 2,000-pound and 5,000-pound class weapons. Pickaxe Mountain is a different animal entirely. Given how openly Trump has talked about it publicly, I would actually read that as somewhat unusual. Normally, you don't hear a president telegraph a specific target like that days in advance, unless there's either a strategic signaling purpose behind it, essentially trying to pressure Iran back to the table without actually pulling the trigger, or the operational planning is far enough along that leadership isn't worried about giving away the element of surprise. I genuinely don't know which of those it is, and anyone online telling you they know for certain isn't being straight with you. What I can tell you with confidence is that if the U.S. does commit to striking Pickaxe Mountain, based on everything the weapons experts have said publicly, it would almost certainly require multiple MOP-class weapons stacked in sequence, essentially using the first bombs to punch through the outer rock layers and subsequent bombs to get progressively deeper. That's actually a documented tactic for exactly this kind of extremely hardened target. And even then, success isn't guaranteed given how uncertain the actual depth and layout of the facility still is. I also want to take a second and talk about what this means for the people flying these missions, because that's a part of the story that I don't think gets enough attention. These are incredibly long, incredibly demanding missions, especially for the B-2 crews. You're talking about pilots strapped into a two-person cockpit for well over 24 hours, round trip in some cases, multiple aerial refuelings, flying directly into contested airspace with layered air defenses, all while carrying out an extremely precise weapons release against a target that's been planned down to the meter. There is zero margin for error on a mission like that. The training pipeline behind it, the simulator time, the mission planning, the intelligence fusion between satellite imagery, human intelligence, and electronic surveillance, all of that has to come together perfectly for a strike like Midnight Hammer to succeed. I have an enormous amount of respect for the air crews and the support personnel making these missions happen, regardless of how any of us feel about the broader politics of the conflict. Because at the end of the day, these are real people executing an extraordinarily difficult and dangerous job. I remember from my own time flying combat missions in the F-15E, even a mission lasting a few hours can wear you down. The constant scanning, the checklist discipline, the awareness that one mistake on weapons release timing can mean an aborted mission over a heavily defended area. Now stretch that intensity out over more than a full day for a B-2 crew, with multiple air refuelings, tanker and bomber flying in close formation at altitude, fuel lines connected, both aircraft holding precise airspeed and heading, and you start to get a sense of how much rides on training and repetition. None of that shows up in the dramatic explosion footage that ends up online, but it's the actual foundation that makes a strike like Midnight Hammer possible in the first place, and I think it's worth pausing on that instead of just fixating on the size of the bomb. I also think it's worth talking for a minute about what happens on the Iranian side of this, because a responsible breakdown has to include that too. Iran's response throughout this war has largely followed a pattern. missile and drone strikes against Israeli territory, against U.S. bases and assets across the Gulf, and repeated attempts to restrict or close the Strait of Hormuz, along with strikes against commercial shipping that Tehran has tied directly to the reason the ceasefire collapsed on July 7th. Iran has also used proxy forces, most notably Hezbollah out of Lebanon, to open additional fronts. And there have been reported Iranian attacks on Gulf states, including Bahrain and Jordan, just in the past few days, as this latest round of strikes has escalated. On the nuclear question specifically, it's worth remembering that going all the way back to the start of this war, published U.S. intelligence community assessments were reportedly at odds with the administration's public claims about how close Iran actually was to a weapon. That's a genuine point of dispute among credible sources, and I think a fair breakdown owes you that context rather than just presenting one side's framing as settled fact. None of that changes the reality of what weapons are being used or where they're being used. But it does matter for understanding why this conflict has been so difficult to bring to a lasting close even after multiple ceasefire attempts. One more piece of context I think rounds this out well. This isn't the first time bunker busters and Iran's nuclear program have crossed paths. Back in June of 2025, during what's been called the 12-Day War, Israel struck Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure first, which provoked Iranian counterstrikes, and the United States then joined in with the Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan strikes I mentioned earlier, using the MOP for the first time in combat. The conflict ended in a ceasefire, but it clearly didn't resolve the underlying tension because here we are just over a year later in a full-scale war that's already cost well over $100 billion and has repeatedly threatened one of the most important choke points in the global economy. I bring that up because I think it's important context for anyone trying to figure out where things go from here. This pattern of strike, ceasefire, and re-escalation has repeated itself more than once already, and there's no guarantee the current round ends any differently unless something changes in the underlying negotiations. I also want to walk you through, quickly, what a bunker buster mission profile actually looks like from planning to execution, because I think it demystifies a lot of what you see in the headlines. It starts with intelligence, satellite imagery over months or even years, to build a model of the target, its depth, its construction, its access points, that gets fused with any available human intelligence and electronic signals data. From there, weaponeers, the specialists who calculate exactly what it takes to defeat a given target, determine how many weapons and in what sequence, sometimes a first bomb to breach an entry point and a follow-up bomb to go deeper through that hole. Then it goes to mission planning, working out routes that avoid enemy air defenses, refueling tracks, timing windows, and backup options if something goes wrong. Only after all of that does a bomb actually leave the aircraft. It's a slow, methodical process built on redundancy, and that's why a strike like Midnight Hammer, or whatever comes next at Pickaxe Mountain, isn't decided and executed overnight, even when the rhetoric moves fast. Let me also address something I've been seeing a lot of confusion about online, the difference between what CENTCOM confirms officially and what gets reported based on footage or anonymous sourcing. A lot of the dramatic video you're seeing circulating right now, claiming to show specific bunker buster impacts, is often unverified as to the exact weapon used. CENTCOM in several cases has declined to confirm the specific munition in a given strike, even when independent outlets like the War Zone have made educated assessments based on the blast signature or debris. That's actually a really important distinction. An explosion that looks massive on camera doesn't necessarily tell you whether it was a 2,000-pound JDAM, a 5,000-pound GBU-72, or something else entirely. And I'd encourage you to be skeptical of any channel telling you with total certainty exactly what weapon caused a specific explosion, unless they're citing an actual on-the-record confirmation. So where does that leave us? As of this week, we are in a confirmed, active, and escalating bombing campaign against Iran, using a full spectrum of American bunker buster capability, from 2,000-pound JDAMs up through the 5,000-pound GBU-72, with the 30,000-pound GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator sitting in reserve as the weapon that already leveled Fordo last year and now has Pickaxe Mountain explicitly named as a potential future target by the president himself. Whether that strike actually happens, and whether it would even be effective against a facility buried that deep, remains to be seen, and I'll be watching this closely and keeping you updated as more verified information comes out. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know exactly what happens next, because, frankly, nobody outside a very small circle in Washington and Tehran actually does. But I wanted to give you the clearest, most accurate breakdown I can put together, as somebody who's spent a career around exactly this kind of hardware and exactly this kind of mission planning. Before I let you go, I want to say two things. First, if this kind of deep dive breakdown is valuable to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I'm going to keep tracking this story as it develops, and I don't want you to miss the next update the moment something new is confirmed. Second, drop a comment below and let me know what part of this you want me to go deeper on next time. whether that's more on the B-2 and how these long-duration missions actually get planned, more on the Strait of Hormuz, and why it matters so much to the global economy, or a full technical breakdown of exactly how these penetrator warheads are engineered. I read every comment, and it genuinely shapes what I cover next. And if you're new here, welcome to Max Afterburner. This channel is built around exactly this kind of breakdown, real aviation and military background applied to the headlines, no hype for hype's sake. Just the clearest picture I can give you. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe out there, and as always, this is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, signing off.